Okay, so welcome to all of you. Our talk tonight is on the union of body and soul. And we speak about that as a substantial union. Substantial union means an essential union. That body and soul in man aren't, accidentally related. It's not as if the human soul just happened to fall into this body and that's not essential to it. And so when we say that there's a substantial union, we mean an essential union between body and soul. That it's not an accident that my soul has somehow fallen into this body. Now, I think that's easy to understand with regard to plants and brute animals. Plants and brute animals have a body, obviously, and an animating principle, right? Because they're alive. A live plant is different than a dead one. A live cat is different from a dead one. And so the live one has to have something that the dead one doesn't, that makes it alive. And philosophers call that the soul. Right? And so in that sense, brute animals have souls, something that makes them alive, the animating principle. And so do oak trees. Right? And a live oak tree has got something that a dead tree doesn't, an animating principle. And I think it's easy to see that they go together, that there's an essential union, a substantial union between the body and the soul in the other animals. But it's more difficult in the case of man. And the reason for that is because we have mortal bodies and immortal souls. Right? So somebody might think, well, they don't go together, essentially, because they have very different natures. In other words, precisely because of the nobility of the human soul, we might think that it so transcends the body that it doesn't essentially belong to the body, and that the body is a kind of prison of the soul. And this was the view of some great philosophers, including Plato. Right? And so Plato, precisely because he grasped the nobility of the human soul, he thought that he tended to overly separate body and soul, thinking of them as two different substances, and that the man is really only the soul, and that the body is a kind of a prison or like a car or something. So that the relation between the man and the soul and the body would be like that of a man in his car, or a rider and his horse. So it'd be like the body would be like a mobile prison. And that's wrong. We're going to see that's wrong. Now Plato came to this because he rightly understood what we looked at last time and the time before, that the human soul is spiritual. And that in our material world, the human soul alone is spiritual. Right? And that was a great milestone in the history of man. Plato's coming to theorize about the spiritual soul. Right? It was precisely because Plato was so great that he had this problem. But Plato failed to do justice to something else that common sense shows us. And that is that our bodies and souls go together to make up the whole human being. Right? The whole human being isn't just our soul, but our soul joined to our body. And that's the person. Right? The person is the composite of body and soul. And here, Plato's pupil, Aristotle, corrected his master. In Greek philosophy, one of the most beautiful things is you have a series of teachers. You have Socrates, who teaches Plato, and then Plato, who teaches Aristotle. And Aristotle was a pupil of Plato for something like 20 years. Right? For 20 years, he sat at the feet of Plato until finally he became independent. And then he had to go on to criticize his master. And he has a famous line, "I'm a friend of Plato, but more a friend of truth." Right? That's something that we always have to remember. We're more friends with truth, or we ought to be, than with even our own masters or friends. Okay, so Aristotle criticized Plato precisely for this, for not seeing the substantial union of body and soul in man. In other words, that the human soul is the substantial form of our body. What do we mean by that? That the human soul informs our body and makes it a human body, and is united to it in the closest union that we have in our human experience. Right? The two go together to make up one thing, right? The human being, the human person. Now, Plato was followed in this by a famous modern philosopher, Descartes. Descartes likewise thought that man is essentially two things, a soul and a body. He called it a thinking thing, that would be our soul, and an extended thing, a thing with dimensions, our body. And his greatest difficulty, Descartes, was seeing how do you put them together? And he never solved it. He tried to solve it by thinking, well, maybe the point of union of body and soul is the pineal gland in the brain, because it was something that nobody knew what it did. And so that was his hypothesis, that the pineal gland is the union. That's ridiculous. No, how could a bodily part of us be the union of body and soul? The body and the soul aren't united in a particular part, but all throughout, right? Our soul is in our entire body. Not just in the pineal gland. And that idea that we're two things, a thinking thing and an extended thing, is contrary to our experience. We know that we are one being who does both things, thinks and has a body that has dimensions, right? And yet we're one. And philosophy always has to start with common sense. Right? That's its foundation. And if we ever depart from common sense, then the common person has to stop us and say, stop! That goes against common experience. And so in our everyday experience, we know that we're one person, and yet we do things like thinking and loving, which we showed a couple weeks ago, were spiritual activities, and yet we do other things like seeing and touching and running, which we do with our body. So we do some things without our body, thinking and loving, and other things with our body, breathing, seeing, touching, walking, etc. And so that shows us that there's a union between our body and soul that is essential. And so we have to defend both things. Plato's insight that the soul transcends the body, that's true. Right? That's a great truth. And Aristotle's insight that the soul and the body go together. Right? Both are true. The soul transcends the body, and yet the body is an essential part of the person. And so this has to do with what we did in the first talk, when we looked at man's place in the cosmos, and we said that man's place is the intersection of the material world and the spiritual world. Right? Through our bodies, we belong to the physical world as its highest part, and through our souls, we belong to the spiritual world as its lowest part. Right? The lowest part of the spiritual world and the highest part of the physical world, and yet those two parts are united in us essentially. Right? Not accidentally. And so that's our place. That's our nature. And it's odd. Right? it's peculiar, because through our bodies, yes, we're the highest of the material world, but we're mortal. And through our souls, we're the lowest of the spiritual world, but yet we're immortal. And so part of us is immortal, naturally, and the other part is naturally mortal. Right? And that's kind of peculiar. But it's precisely because of our place, right? To be at that intersection, which is such a beautiful place. St. Thomas is the great St. Thomas Aquinas, because St. Thomas did a profound study of Aristotle. And so St. Thomas follows Aristotle on the substantial union of body and soul. And thus, St. Thomas is the great defender of the unity of the human person. And the Church in her magisterial documents very often quotes St. Thomas in teaching this. And so St. Thomas has a beautiful teaching about this. He explains how the soul, precisely because of its nobility, transcends the matter that it informs. So the human soul, precisely because it's the highest kind of form in our visible world, isn't completely submerged in the physical world. And that's why it can separate at death. Right? We're not locked in to the physical world like the souls of animals and plants, or like other forms in the physical world. Right? Because we've got a higher kind of form. And there's a principle in philosophy that the higher thing can do what the lower things do, but yet transcends it. And that's precisely the case with the human soul. Right? It does what an animal soul can do, animates a body, but yet transcends the very body that it animates. Right? So it's not locked in to the body. It's not entirely embraced by matter, the human soul. Right? It's not a form merged in matter. It's in matter, but it's not, submerged in it, not locked into it. Because it has spiritual operations. Right? Because we can know and love. Right? That's why our soul isn't locked into our body like a dog soul is. Or a bear soul, or whatever. And so that's why the human soul, even though it's united to the body, can be separated from the body and still be what it is. Now, here's in order for us to be one and not two, philosophers speak of something called an act of being. That there's got to be one act of being that unites the whole of us. Because when you have two things, you've got two beings. And so if Descartes or Plato were correct, that we're really two things, a thinking thing and a thing with dimensions, somehow united, we would be two and not one. We'd have two beings. And our experience shows us that's not true. Right? So how is it that we've got one being, and yet these two different principles, a body and a soul? Well, St. Thomas explains it that the soul has being in itself. And that's what we looked at last time and the time before. That's hard to grasp what we mean. Have being in itself means that it's something that can subsist on its own. Right? That's why the soul is immortal, because it's got being in itself. But then how can we be one, body and soul? Well, the soul communicates, as it were, its being to the body, as long as it's joined to the body. So, and when does that happen? Conception. Right? At conception, God infuses the spiritual soul into the union of egg and sperm, and at that very moment, the soul has being in itself, and it gives that to the body, so that the composite body and soul now has one being, that of the soul, but the body's included in it, and the body will share that being, will be a human being, as long as the soul is united to it. But when the soul stops being united to it at death, and the reason for that is because the body loses the disposition to keep the soul because it's damaged in one way or another through disease or accident. The body loses that capacity, the soul separates, the soul keeps its own being, and the body loses that human being, and it's not a human being anymore. What is it? It's a corpse, the body. It's not a human being. Looks like a human being for a while till it decomposes, but it's not because it's dead, and human beings are alive. And so the soul gives human being, as it were, to the body as long as they're united, but when they separate, the soul keeps the human being, but the body loses it. And that only happens with the human soul. With animal souls, with animals, the brute animals, the animating principle, which we call the soul, doesn't have being in itself. It's only the composite that has being in itself. And so when the soul separates from the body because the body gets injured or sick and loses the disposition to keep the soul, neither part remains. Right? Because when the two parts separate, neither one can keep the being, the dog being or the bear being or the giraffe being. It's only when they're together that, because neither part has being in itself. It's only the composite that has being in itself. But it's not that way in the human being. Right? Because in the human being, the soul has being in itself. It gives it to the body as long as they're joined. And when they separate, the soul keeps that being, goes its way, for better or worse, to heaven or purgatory or hell, but the body decomposes until the resurrection, in which God will join them back together. Now the soul is naturally, right? We said it's a substantial union. That means an essential union. That means it's part of man's nature to be body and soul. Right? It's our nature to be in union, body and soul. And it's against nature for the soul to lose its body. Nevertheless, the soul's nature is to be immortal. It will continue. But it's part of the nature of a human being to be both body and soul. Now, in nature, natural things always have an inclination, a natural inclination, to be according to nature and to conserve their being. Right? And so we can say that the soul has a natural inclination to keep its body. And the body has a natural inclination to keep the soul. And that's why we instinctively shrink from death. Right? Because it's against our nature for them to be separated. It's inevitable. But nevertheless, it's part of the nature of man to be body and soul together. And so we naturally shrink from death. Right? And that's, even though we know through faith that death introduces a better state. Right? We can't see God in this life. And it's only after this life. And so death is a good thing if we die in the Lord. A very good thing. But nevertheless, since it means losing our body, which is part of our nature, there's something in us that naturally shrinks from that. Right? And that's part of the human condition. And that's why it's very fitting that God resurrect the body in the end. Because it would be strange if it's, since it's natural for the human being to be body and soul together, it would be strange, wouldn't it? If we have the body and soul together for, 80 years or 90 years, 100 if we're lucky, and then for eternity, we're just part of us. Just a soul. That would be kind of peculiar. And it won't be that way. In other words, for all eternity, we'll be restored, body and soul together. And for the just, body glorified. And thus, the body completely made adequate to the soul. Here on earth, right, the body in some sense weighs down the soul because the body has its needs, the body has its limits, has great limits. In the resurrection, we'll have our two parts again, but the body will be brought up to the level of the soul, such that whatever the soul wills for the body will be. Yeah. But we'll have a whole other talk on the resurrection later. Okay, let's look at some errors with regard to body and soul. Because errors are helpful because it helps you to see the truth. In the Middle Ages, some great Catholic theologians, including St. Bonaventure, had a funny idea, sounds funny to us today, that in the human being, there are actually more than one soul. There would be a spiritual soul, and yet we'd also have a kind of animal soul that does what animal souls do, and then a vegetative soul that does what the animating principle in plants does. And so we would be a kind of combination of body, vegetative soul, animal soul, and spiritual soul. And the reason why they thought that is it's because we do all of those things. Right? We've got a body. We do vegetative functions like plants, nourishment and growth and reproduction. We do animal functions, sensing and locomotion, and we do spiritual functions. So that, we need a soul of each kind to supply for all those functions. But what's the problem with that? If we had three different souls, what would we be? We'd be three and not one. Right? And there's got to be just one form by which we are what we are. And so our rational soul does everything that an animal soul does, but so much more, because it does spiritual things too. And our rational soul does everything that the animating principle of a plant does. But again, so much, much more. Right? And again, it's the same principle. A higher thing can do whatever a lower thing can do, but in a more perfect, in a more eminent way. Or we could say it like this: the higher level doesn't destroy the lower level, but elevates it and perfects it. Right? So the fact that we've got a spiritual soul doesn't negate, for example, that we've got a body. But it elevates the body, it gives the human body a dignity that the animal body doesn't have. Right? And we use the same principle when we talk about grace. That grace presupposes nature, doesn't destroy it. So when a baby's baptized, human nature stays the same, but something higher is added, the life of God. And that doesn't destroy nature, but it perfects nature and elevates nature. Right? So the same thing happens with our spiritual soul. It doesn't destroy our animal functions, our vegetative functions, but elevates them and gives them a new dignity that immeasurably surpasses the dignity of the animals. Okay. Another error of the Middle Ages was in the opposite direction. Instead of saying that every man has three souls, an Arab philosopher, his name was Averroes, said that there's only one intellect, we could say one spiritual soul for all men. Right? So instead of saying that each one has three, he said, no, everyone just has one. In other words, there's one intellect for all of us, and we're all kind of tapping into it when we think. And that intellect would be the divine intellect, or a divine intellect. He thought there were levels of divinity. And what would be the consequence of that? If there's just one intellect that we all tap into, and since we showed a few weeks ago that we have a spiritual soul because we have an intellect, and because we have an intellect and a spiritual soul, we're immortal. If there was just one intellect that we're all tapping into, who would be immortal? Just that one. Just God. And our souls would be mortal. And this is what Averroes taught as the teaching of Aristotle. Now, it's not the teaching of Aristotle, but he made a persuasive case that it was the teaching of Aristotle. And thus he held that, okay, I know this goes against the Quran, which teaches that the soul is immortal. But in philosophy, the soul is mortal. By faith, we have to hold that it's immortal. Yeah. Now, apparently he held some kind of double truth. One thing would be true in philosophy, and another thing would be held to be true by faith. But you can't, obviously the human mind can't do that, right? If we hold two contradictories, we have to think that the one is really true, and the other is just said to be true. And apparently that's what he held, that philosophy is really true, and what the faith teaches is just said to be true for the masses. Because it's good for the masses to think that the soul is immortal, and that there's judgment, so that will be good. Now, it's not surprising that Muslim theologians didn't think very highly of this philosopher, Averroes. And obviously his positions were condemned. And not only that, it had, I think, very negative consequences for the later development of the Muslim world. Because they tended to associate, after that, philosophy with impious positions, like denying the immortality of the soul. And so it was one of the factors, I think, among others, leading to a certain distrust, or maybe even a strong distrust of human reason and its capacity to think about divine things. And that leads to an attitude that we also have in the West, in modern times. We call it fideism. There are two opposite errors, rationalism and fideism. Rationalism is what Averroes was doing, saying, okay, you've got this truth of philosophy and this other truth of theology. The real truth is philosophy. In other words, reason is above faith. That's a lot of the modern world thinks like that, in the West too, right? That's scientism. We think that whatever science says is true, and the faith will just make it fit. The science is above faith. And that's wrong, right? If God speaks, and faith is our receiving God's revelation, and God is truth, well, faith is a greater knowledge than reason. But they can't conflict, no, because God made reason too. He made both, faith and reason. And so they've got to fit together. So rationalism would be putting reason above faith, Averroes, or modern culture. But the opposite error is also bad, putting faith so much against reason as to say reason has nothing to contribute. That we go by faith alone, without reason. And we call that fideism. And it's not uncommon that good Christians are often fideists. We'll go by faith alone, and we don't need this philosophy business. For one thing, it's difficult. That's true. And it can lead you into errors. That's very true. But that doesn't mean, just because it can be abused, doesn't mean that it shouldn't be rightly used. Because how are you going to correct someone who uses reason badly? There's only one way. Use reason rightly. Yeah. And so, precisely because they're bad philosophies, we need to cultivate in the church good philosophy. And the church has always done that. No, that's why the church gives so much importance to people like St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas and so many others. Okay. So there's not just one intellect for all men, but each one of us has our own. How do we know? Because it's just common sense. We all know that who's thinking when I'm thinking? I'm thinking. I mean, that's about as elementary we all experience it. We experience that our act of thinking is our own. Okay, let's look now at why God would have wanted to put together in man these two so different parts, mortal body and immortal soul. Right? And that's something we should wonder about. Why did he do it? And St. Thomas, in his Summa of Theology, he has a beautiful question in which he wonders this. Right? He asks the question, why did God make us like this? Right? And we said the principal reason is our place in creation, our place as the intersection. That we belong to both orders, the material and the spiritual. And St. Thomas then gives another reason. He thinks precisely because we're the lowest of spiritual beings, the angels are all above us, because of that, we need the body. And he thinks of it like this. The angels, because they're higher spiritual beings, when God created the angels, he made them full of knowledge. We call that innate ideas. Right? When God made St. Michael the Archangel, he filled him with ideas. He filled him with knowledge of the natural world. And the same thing went for Satan. Right? Because God made Satan good too. And he likewise was filled with all kinds of knowledge. And the same thing would go for all the angels, those who fell and those who didn't. And so they came into the world full of infused ideas, full of knowledge that God put into them directly. And so they don't need a body to find things out. Right? An angel doesn't need to learn things through senses because he already knows everything belonging to the natural order. We can't quite imagine because it's above us, right? We don't know how it works. We don't know the mechanism. But they do. And since we don't, right, so the human being, because we're the lowest of spiritual creatures, God made us with minds at birth that are blank, right? And we see that every time we see an infant come into the world, that he seems to have, and his mind is a blank slate. Right? That's a phrase of Aristotle, that we come into this world with our minds as blank slates. And they have to be written on first through sense knowledge. Right? All our knowledge has its point of departure in our sense knowledge. Our external senses, and then our internal senses, imagination, association, and memory. And that's why the child needs to develop to a certain point before he can start to reason, because his sense organs have to develop, and above all, his internal sense organs, where we have the imagination, association, and memory. They have to develop. And so, our intellects, and therefore our wills likewise, are blank at creation, at the creation of our souls. And so, we need the body, because that's how we get our intellectual ideas. Right? All of our ideas in the natural order come from abstracting from our sense knowledge. So if we didn't have a body, if God just made us our souls without a body, our souls would be they wouldn't have a natural way of getting ideas. Now, obviously, God can supply that, and He will for the separated souls. Right? He'll give them a higher way, but that's not natural. So our natural way of learning is through the body, right? And that's why it's fitting that our souls be joined essentially to a body that's endowed with excellent sense knowledge. Right? Our five external senses, and above all, our internal senses, whose organ is the brain. Right? And it's the imagination, association, and memory, especially, because when we abstract our ideas, That's what we're abstracting it from there, from our imagination, association, and memory, whose organ is the brain. Right? And that's why the human being needs to have a better brain than any other animal. Right? Because we use that as the point of departure for getting all of our our intellectual ideas. Now, somebody might object here and say, well, if man is man needs a body for sense knowledge, and since we're the highest of the animals, we should have the most excellent senses. But it seems like that we don't, because there are animals that do all of our senses better. So, for example, a dog has so much better sense of smell than we do. An eagle has a much better sense of sight. Some animals have echolocation, and so a much better sense of, hearing. And so we might think that our bodies are not as well equipped as that of the animals, or at least some animals. And the same thing would go for instincts. How is it that the animals seem to be so well endowed with instincts, whereas we're not? Right? Wouldn't it be better if we had these great instincts like the animals? And so there's a beautiful answer to this. The answer is that precisely because our bodies are the bodies of a rational being, in other words, precisely because our bodies are meant to serve our soul, which is rational, and since we have reason, we can use reason to adapt to every different situation. And so it would be very unfitting if God gave us a body like that of the animals. Because the animals, if we go to the zoo, we see that the animals, each different animal, is got a body adapted to a certain type of environment. Right? And it's marvelous. The penguin, perfectly adapted to an extreme environment, or a polar bear, or animals that live in the tropic. Each animal is perfectly adapted to a particular environment. And he's given things like claws and hoofs and horns and fangs to do very particular things. And he's been given incredible instincts to do very particular things. Fly 3,000 miles south for the winter, and to know exactly how to get back, and to swim thousands of miles to lay eggs, and then to go back. But only to do that, right? The animals that have those instincts, that's the only place they can go. They're determined by their instincts. They're limited by their fur coat. They're limited by their fangs and whatever it is, because it suits them only for a particular environment. Whereas God made man without any of those things. And that's fitting, right? He made man, for one thing, naked. Right? We might think, well, that's unfitting. No, because he's provided the animals with these fantastic coats. Why did he leave us coatless? Well, if he naturally gave us heavy coats, that's right, it would be terrible. What would we do in St. Louis in the summer? In other words, precisely because he gave us reason, he didn't give us coats by nature. Right? And so St. Thomas, when he asks about this, he says, well, he gave us reason and hands. That's what we need. And then he left us, as it were, naked with regard to the other things. Without fangs, without tusks, without horns, without claws, without wings. Now, our son, when he was little, he wanted to fly, and he was a little upset that God didn't provide us with wings. But again, by giving us reason and hands, we can make planes. Not as good as wings, maybe, but... Yeah. And so the point is that God made all the other animal bodies specialists. But he made the human body to be non-specialized because we're rational. And so our body is perfectly fitted to our soul precisely because it doesn't have the things that other animals have. But it has what we need, and that's a really good organ of the internal senses, brain. And that's when a paleontologist looks for the evidence of a human being in the distant past. That's what he looks for, is a brain case that's the same size as ours. Right? And if he finds it, even if other things look slightly different, I don't know, Neanderthal man, that's a human being. And if he doesn't find that brain case, it's not a human being. It's a primate. Yeah. We'll talk about evolution in another talk, so I'm not going to get into it. But it has to do with this. Now, in other words, just let me say one thing about evolution. That a real difficulty for the theory of evolution is, in the animal world, precisely, all the animal bodies are specialized. And evolution, natural selection, tends to do what? If anything, add to the specialization. And so, since the human soul is infused by God directly, created out of nothing, and that's an act of God, it means that, the chimps leading up to man didn't have spiritual souls. They didn't have reason. And thus there would be no benefit for them to have non-specialized bodies. Right? A non-rational chimp or primate needs to have a specialized body because he doesn't have reason. And so how could you get an evolution of leading, because you either got a rational soul or you don't. Right? It's an all or nothing. And so the idea of the evolution of the body, anyway, it's a huge problem, but we'll say that for another time. Okay, but there's an even more difficult objection to the composition of body and soul in man. Not only is our body not specialized, and we can say, yeah, that's a good thing, but why is it that he made us with mortal bodies and immortal souls? And so St. Thomas gives a great answer to this. So the first thing he says is that the body is for the sake of the soul, just like matter is for the sake of form. Even an artist, when an artist wants to make a statue, he'll pick out the matter, say marble, to serve the form he wants to give it. Right? He'll use marble instead of mud because marble will hold the form and mud won't. Right? So we tend to, when we make things, we pick out the matter for the sake of the form. And God likewise. He'll choose this matter for the sake of the form, which is our soul. So that adds to the question, why did he pick mortal matter to serve our immortal soul? And the answer is, well, we've already given it. Precisely because our soul is the lowest, we need to learn through our sense knowledge. That's the point of departure. And so we need a body for the senses. And we need a body precisely with excellent touch, so that we can have the hands to make things with our reason. Right? So we need, above all, a very fine sense of touch in our hands, and thus we need a body that's very delicate composition. Well, whenever you get a very delicate composition, it can naturally, what? Decompose. Right? The finer our composition, the easier it is for it to get disrupted, for it to come apart. And so it's precisely the beauty of our bodies that gives us an acute sense of pain, for example. Right? We can suffer precisely because we have such beautifully sensitive bodies. And so the body, by its very nature, is decomposable, right? Corruptible. God couldn't make a body that's naturally incorruptible. He can make it supernaturally incorruptible, but not naturally. In the resurrection, our bodies will be supernaturally incorruptible. But here on earth, He's given us, first, body in its natural state, which is corruptible. St. Thomas makes an analogy with a blacksmith who wants to make a saw. And to make a saw, well, you're going to pick a material that will cut. And so you won't pick, say, wood, because that won't cut, but you'll pick iron to cut. But iron has this defect, that it rusts. And so, will that stop you from making your saw out of iron? No. You still make your saw out of iron because it cuts, but it'll have this defect, a natural defect, of rusting. And so it's, God made a body that was very sensitive, but it's got this natural defect, it's corruptible. Now, we might think, well, we can make stainless steel. So couldn't God have made an incorruptible body? And of course the answer is yes, He's God. It wouldn't have been naturally incorruptible, though, because it's part of the nature of a finely composed body that it corrupts. And so God could have gone above nature, and that's exactly what He did. Where? In Eden. Right? So when God created Adam and Eve, He gave them human nature, but He gave them something that doesn't belong to human nature. An immortal body. A body that wouldn't be subject to death if they were faithful to God. Right? There was an original covenant. Right? And God laid down a condition for that gift, precisely because that gift was gratuitous, above nature. Right? Immortality doesn't belong to human nature. But God gave it to them above human nature with the condition that their soul be subordinated to God, obeying His law. In other words, He made man's body subordinate to the soul, immortal, but under the condition that man's soul remained subordinate to God in obedience. And when man was disobedient to God, what happened? The body stopped being obedient to the soul. And that's original sin. And that's what we've all inherited. Our body now does its own thing. And God permits that because we merited the loss of that gift. Right? And we'll talk more about this in a talk on original sin in the future, in the fall, I think. Sorry. Right, so God wanted to remedy our condition, but He made it conditional on man's fidelity. The fidelity of the first man, Adam. And Adam received it in trust for us, but he lost it. He lost the trust, and thus we lost it in him. Okay. Let's look at another error, reincarnation. Much of the world believes in reincarnation, and obviously in the East, in Hinduism, Buddhism, but unfortunately, it seems like more and more also in the West, people are sympathetic to reincarnation. They cast off the Christian idea of personal immortality, and they take on a belief in reincarnation. And even in philosophers like Plato, it seems, fell into this error. So Plato held a kind of doctrine of reincarnation. And the reason for that is because he didn't see the substantial union of body and soul. Right? Precisely because he saw the body as an accident, as a kind of prison. He thought, well, the soul, which is the real man, since it fell into this prison, well, why couldn't it fall into some other prison in another existence? Since the soul is naturally immortal and the body is mortal, it would seem logical that the soul could fall into this body, and then as a kind of judgment about how I lived, it would fall into a better body or a worse body. And that's basically the Hindu, that's where he got it from. Plato got that from India. And so the idea would be that the kind of body we have would be a judgment on our past life, our life in the previous body. And if we lived that previous life, I don't know, like a pig, we would be put into a pig body, or worse. Yeah. All right, so what should we think about this? Yeah. Well, again, it goes against our common sense knowledge that we're wrong. Right? That our body and our soul aren't accidentally joined. That my body is also part of my personal identity, and an essential part, not an accidental part. Right? It's not a part of me that I could just, lose and get another body, say a pig body, and I'd still be me. Right? Because it's very much an essential part of me, first of all, that I be a human being and not a pig. And secondly, that I be this human being with this kind of body and not some other kind of body. And that's part of who I am. And all of us maybe would, at times in our life, like to have some other body. But we know that this body is us, right? Is part of our personal identity. So we could call that a dualist error, right? To think that my body and my soul are unconnected, and it's just by chance that they fell in this way. And so let's refute reincarnation in two steps. So if somebody holds that a human soul after death could be put into an animal body, or even worse, a plant body, let's say an animal body, that's crazy. Because that's to fail to see the essential difference between a human soul and, say, a pig soul. Right? A pig soul is so different than a human soul. A human soul is spiritual, right? And therefore naturally immortal. A pig soul is irrational. Right? It's not rational, therefore it's not spiritual, and therefore it's not immortal, and therefore it can't know any universal idea at all. It can't know the good. It can't seek justice. It can't admire beauty. It can't love God. It's a radically different kind of thing. So to say that a human soul could fall into a pig body and serve the function of would be to fail to see, ultimately, the difference between a pig and a human being. And thus it would deny the dignity of a human being. And thus it's a terrible error. I don't think that's hard to see. What about a human soul after death going into a different human body? That mistake, that error, is less grave. But it's still a great error. Because again, it goes against our common sense that our body isn't an accident of us, but is an essential part of who we are. For one thing, our body gives us our temperament. Right? We'll look later at the four temperaments. Sanguine, melancholic, phlegmatic, choleric. Each one of us at birth, because of our body, has a certain tendency to experience emotions in one way or another way. We experience certain emotions more profoundly than other emotions because of our temperament. And that comes to us through our body. Through our body, we're gifted with different natural gifts. And some in one way, others in another way. And clearly, that's part of who we are. Right? That's part of our identity. And therefore, it wouldn't make any sense that God would take my soul, which informs this body, and after death, put it into some totally different kind of body. Who would I be? Would I be the first one or the second one? It would be a kind of schizophrenia. Right? It's contrary to common sense. And furthermore, we build up our identity not without our body. We build up our moral, right? Our identity, our personal unique identity, we could say has two origins. First, our bodies. Right? And that's our particular matter, our DNA, our particular kind of body, our particular temperament, our particular natural gifts. And then in that body that we're given at conception, we forge a moral identity. And that moral identity is even more important. That's even more us. And that's how we make ourselves through our free actions, whether they're acts of virtue or acts of vice. Right? By doing disordered actions, I make myself disordered. But how do I do those disordered actions? With my body or without my body? Obviously, with my body. My body shares in all my disorder. And it also shares in my order. Right? So when I do virtuous acts, do I do it with my body or without my body? Obviously with my body. And therefore, it's fitting, isn't it, that the body share in that identity that we've built up through our free acts with our body. And therefore, the body should share, shouldn't it, in the reward or punishment that comes to us from what we've freely chosen with our bodies. And that's why in heaven and hell, we'll get our bodies back. This is another reason why we'll get our bodies back. Because we worked out our moral identity with our bodies, in our bodies. And so it's fitting that our bodies share in that identity forever. And so our souls, even when they get separated from the body at death, they're always going to be the souls of this body, not of that body. Right? Our souls. So even though, let's take the saints in heaven, except for Mary, all the saints in heaven are right now are separated souls, waiting for their bodies at the last judgment. So St. Peter doesn't have his body; he's just got his soul. But his soul, whose soul is it? His. In other words, it's the soul that belongs to that body, Peter's body, and not my body. In other words, he still has his identity. He's not, right now, St. Peter isn't a whole person. He's missing an essential part of him. He's got the more important part, which is the soul, the primary part. But he's missing an essential part of his body. And so his soul will always be the soul of that body. And he'll get that body back in the resurrection. In other words, the body with that DNA, the body with that temperament, the body with that qualities. Yeah. And the same thing goes for all of us. Okay, and this is something that the Church teaches infallibly, the substantial union of body and soul. And so it's contrary to the faith to cast doubt on the substantial union of body and soul. And we could say this is one of the central parts of the Church's teaching on the human being. Right? The substantial union. And it's such a beautiful part because it's beautiful because it gives dignity to the body. Right? If we were dualists, if we held that just the soul is the man and the body is just an accident, that would mean that the body wouldn't share in the soul's dignity. And if the body doesn't share in the soul's dignity, why would we have to treat the body, say, of our neighbor or our own with respect? And if the body is just a prison, why would we have to treat it with reverence? And you can see tremendous consequences would flow from that. And this was it was the first heresy in the history of the Church. It was called Gnosticism. The idea that the body is evil, that the body is a prison of the soul, and that the man is just the soul. And that this heresy even thought that the soul had a different origin than the body, that the soul is created by God, and the body was created by another God, a lower God, by a kind of cosmic accident. And if that were the case, well then, suicide would be a good thing. It would be better to escape from the body, and that's what these heretics held. And furthermore, what would happen to the Church's teaching on marriage? If the body is essentially evil, as the prison of the soul and the cause of sin, well then to bring new bodies into the world wouldn't be a good thing, would it? And so these heretics, the Gnostics, also later the Manichaeism, they held that marriage was bad. Why? Because of procreation. Because it brings new bodies into the world, which is evil. And so it would be better not to marry, or if you did have to have relations, it would be better not to have procreative sexual relations. And thus homosexuality would be better than marriage, because it wouldn't bring new babies into the world. And so you can see how having a wrong idea about theology and about philosophy here, about the human person, will lead to catastrophic consequences in society. And then we look out into our culture today, and what do we see? We see something so similar. The culture of death is in reality a revival in a different form, but basically the same fundamental attitude as the first heresy in the history of the Church, seeing the body as evil, or simply not having the dignity of the soul. And therefore, if the body is just a body, we could treat it as, in other words, we could have total dominion. If the real me is just the soul, and the body is just an instrument, just a piece is just matter, well then we could totally dominate that matter as we please. This is how the modern world tends to look at the body. Right? It's just, and so what happens, say, to human sexuality, precisely because of the substantial union of body and soul, what we do with our bodies, and especially with regard to procreation, can't be something merely biological, something merely physical, because our bodies are the bodies of spiritual beings. And therefore, human sexuality is radically different from, say, rabbit sexuality. Because rabbit sexuality just makes mortal creatures. But human sexuality participates with God in the creation of a human person, body, and immortal soul. And thus it's something in which we most closely participate with God in His creative act. And so it's the most beautiful on the natural order. It's the most beautiful participation with God. And that's why the Church always regards human sexuality as sacred, as so good that it's sacred. And that's why we don't have total dominion over it, because it's not just ours. It's not just physical. But it's for the creation of a spiritual being. And so the substantial union of body and soul is central to understanding what John Paul II called the theology of the body, the goodness of the body, and therefore the sacredness of human sexuality and marriage. Right? So it's such an important teaching. And we can see in all kinds of other things as well. This is why we can't simply make another human being in a test tube. Right? We can't. This is why in vitro fertilization isn't worthy as a way to reproduce, because precisely because of the dignity of the human body and the union of the body and soul, God wanted the conjugal act to include both parts, right? Conjugal love, which is the principal part, but also the conjugal embrace. And it's fitting that a new human being be the fruit, not just of conjugal love, but of conjugal love with a conjugal embrace, and not merely the act of a technician in a test tube. And there are many other consequences. Even, for example, the dignity the reverence that we show to the body after death. Right? Why do we bury bodies and not just allow them to rot on the street? It's because they're the body of what was a human being, right? Precisely because of the dignity of the human being whose body it was and will be in the resurrection. And that's why also that it's better not to, for example, cremation. It doesn't show as well the dignity to be given to the body. Now, obviously there are cultural aspects to this, but that's why the Church doesn't prefer cremation, right? Because of the reverence to be given to the body, even after it's lost that soul that formerly informed it. And so the body shares in man's dignity as image of God. And so human love has to include both dimensions. It has to be spiritual and expressed through the body. And so John Paul II has beautiful teachings on this. For example, in his encyclical on marriage, he says, sexuality, by means of which man and woman give themselves to one another through acts proper to the spouses and exclusive to them, is by no means something purely biological, but it concerns the inmost being of the human person, the conjugal act. And it's realized in a truly human way only if it's an integral part of the love, right? That would be the conjugal love by which a man and woman commit themselves for life until death. This is why the conjugal act can only be done within marriage, because it's only within marriage that you've got the conjugal love, of which the conjugal act is the natural expression. We'll come back to this when we look at the theology of the body. Benedict has a beautiful discussion of this in his encyclical on love, Deus Caritas Est, God is love. He writes, man is a being made up of body and soul. Right? Man is truly himself when his body and his soul are intimately united. Should he aspire to be pure spirit and reject the flesh as pertaining to his animal nature alone, that would be Manichaeism or Gnosticism, then the spirit and body would both lose their dignity. On the other hand, should he deny spirit and consider matter, the body, as the only reality, right? That's contemporary materialism, he would likewise lose his greatness. And he gives this example from the history of Descartes, he held the dualism. He was a spiritualist. He thought that we are this thinking thing. And he had a friend, Gassendi, who was a materialist. And they would greet each other in this way. Descartes, Gassendi, the materialist, would say to Descartes, "Oh, soul, how are you?" And Descartes would reply, "Oh, flesh, I'm very well." They would call each other soul and flesh. And yet it is neither spirit alone, nor the body alone that loves, right? It is man, a person, a unified creature composed of body and soul who loves. Only when both dimensions are truly united does man attain his true stature. Only thus is love, eros, able to mature and attain its authentic grandeur, as in conjugal love. Nowadays, Christianity of the past is often criticized as having been opposed to the body. We hear this all over. People think that Catholicism thinks that the body is evil and the source of evil, and that sex is bad and dirty. Right? That's what people who are ignorant, that's what they think Catholicism teaches. And it's just exactly the opposite. No, that was the first heresy, and a kind of constant heresy in battle with the Church. And the Church has always held that sexuality is holy and sacred, and that's why we have to protect it. Protect it from being profaned. Protect it from losing its grandeur. So Benedict says, it's true that tendencies of this sort have always existed, usually heresies. Yet the contemporary way of exalting the body, what we see in our culture today, the sexual revolution, the culture of death, that way of exalting the body is deceptive. Eros, reduced to pure sex, has become a commodity, a thing to be bought and sold. Right? This is exactly what happens in one of the biggest problems in the world today, sex slavery, sex trafficking, and the plague of pornography. It's a thing to be bought and sold. Or rather, man himself becomes a commodity. This is hardly man's great yes to the body. Right? What a great line. On the contrary, he now considers his body and his sexuality as the purely material part of himself, to be used and exploited at will. Here we're dealing with the debasement of the human body. The apparent exaltation can quickly turn into a hatred of bodiliness. I think this is what so often happens when people misuse sexuality. It causes depression. Studies have been shown about this in teenage girls, that those who are engaged in promiscuity, in promiscuous sex, the incidence of depression is so much higher. It's something like 40%. Whereas in those who retain their virginity, it's something like, 2%. And it makes sense, because if we treat the body as something merely material, we're going to think of ourselves as that. And of course, that would cause depression. Right? And it's not only that. It's the body is meant to be the vehicle of true love. And true love is the love that gives oneself forever. And so when we use the body for a love that's fake, in other words, we're deceived. Somebody else says that they're going to love us forever, and then they forget about us the next day. Of course that's going to cause depression. Because it's treating us like a commodity instead of a person. And so Benedict ends this by saying, Christian faith has always considered man a unity in duality, a reality in which spirit and matter compenetrate, and in which each one receives a new nobility. And this has so many beautiful applications for the Christian life. Let's take our break here.